There are so many jobs that just don't exist anymore. Modern technology has changed the workforce, and we just won't be able to turn back the clock. One of the most powerful jobs a woman could have in ancient Egypt was God's wife of Amun. Its elimination has nothing to do with technology, but it's kind of a shame that it's just not a thing anymore. When I first started studying Egyptology, I had assumed that there would be female priestesses for female gods and male priests for male gods, but it turns out that's not exactly how things were done in ancient Egypt, and I had no basis for that assumption. It just made sense to me. As it happens, women's roles in the priesthood were rare. The cult of the goddess Hathor, the ancient Egyptian goddess of love, had some roles for female priests, but other than that, there was very little female participation in priestly rituals. Most female jobs in temples had to do with music and singing, making music to please the gods, and it wasn't a particularly powerful role, although it was considered very prestigious and usually held by women of noble birth. But it definitely didn't have anything close to the kind of power that was held by male priests. As you may remember if you've seen previous videos of mine, to be a priest in any Egyptian temple was to be a government official. That government status did not extend to female priests until the New Kingdom. Women's roles in government, whether as part of the priesthood or as rulers, became suddenly expanded during the early part of the New Kingdom. In the 18th dynasty, which I always refer to as the fun one, a new job title appeared for women in Egyptian temples: God's wife of Amun. This job was, for a few generations, seemingly the highest priestly job in the land, second only to the king himself, which, as you may remember, the king was always the highest-ranked Egyptian priest. This role was so prestigious that queens who held it often preferred to be referred to by this title rather than their title of great royal wife. The job of God's wife of Amun typically went to the wife or mother of the current king. This was in keeping with the, to them, newly developed mythology of Amun, which made him the father of every king of Egypt. As such, it was appropriate that the king's mother should be Amun's wife. Furthermore, Amun, in his aspect as a fertility god, had a very large hat, as you can see. So it made sense that the Egyptians would want him to have a sexual partner. So what did this job entail? Well, let's start with the perks. The god's wife of Amun was a position that came with its own palace and lands, as well as a staff of officials to oversee them. And remember that at this point in time, in ancient Egypt, money was grain, so to have your own lands where you could cultivate grain was a really big deal. Illustrations show the god's wife of Amun playing an active role in temple rituals, leading the other priests to the sacred pool and purifying them so that they could be allowed to enter the sacred temple space. She also accompanied the king himself into the innermost sanctuary of the god, the most sacred part of the temple where only the highest, most powerful priests could enter. Just to be clear, the king himself didn't have time to go to every temple every single day. Most days throughout Egypt, it would just be the highest priest in any given temple who would enter the sanctuary and perform rituals for the god. This, then, would have been the main daily duty of the god's wife of Amun alone. What would be done in this innermost sacred space? In every temple of Egypt, regardless of whether it was for Amun or any other god, the high priest would make offerings. Most Egyptologists believe that in addition to making offerings of food, incense, fine wine, and fancy linens, the god's wife of Amun would also be performing some kind of sexual act with the statue of the god in order to stimulate his divine virility. The reason for this assumption goes back to one of the core values of the ancient Egyptians and their religion, the belief that the creation of life was sacred. To them, sex was a powerful and divine act because it led to the creation of life. It wasn't viewed as shameful or sinful as it is in many Abrahamic religions. There are abundant religious texts describing the ancient Egyptian gods performing various sex acts with each other and sometimes just with themselves in order to create other gods. There's relatively little written detail describing a day in the life of the god's wife of Amun, but what's certain is that it was a highly powerful position. The most famous example of this power at work is in the pharaoh Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was the daughter of the king Thutmose I, and as such she inherited the role of god's wife of Amun from her predecessor, Merit Amun. She performed the duties of the god's wife of Amun on behalf of her father the king, and then on behalf of her husband and brother, King Thutmose II. She would only give up the role of God's wife of Amun when she passed it on to her own daughter, Neferu-Re, only when she finally ascended to the role of King of Egypt herself, after a brief period as regent for her stepson Thutmose III. Hatshepsut claimed in several official inscriptions that she only stepped into the role of pharaoh at the will of Amun, and who could dispute her? After all, she had been married to him. There's no written documentation to confirm it, but this is likely the reason that the role of God's wife of Amun would disappear, pretty much, during the reign of Thutmose III, Hatshepsut's stepson and successor. There's a lot of evidence suggesting he was none too pleased to share the first half of his kingship with his stepmother, and that he probably retired the role God's wife of Amun in order to ensure no woman could use it to seize power again. The position did make a comeback after the end of Thutmose III's reign, but by the end of the 18th dynasty it had disappeared. Some watered-down version of this role did come back again during the 19th and later dynasties, with a particularly strong revival during the Third Intermediate Period and during the reign of the Nubian kings. They would change the job to where it traditionally went to the daughter of a king who had to vow to remain a virgin, unmarried. If you're wondering why the ancient Egyptians, a patriarchal society, would create such a powerful role for a woman, it all goes back to holding on to political power. Particularly with the innovation of this role only being held by an unwed virgin, this was a way for the kings of Egypt to keep more royal power close to the vest. By stipulating that the god's wife of Amun couldn't marry anybody, this was a way to prevent Egyptian princesses from marrying foreign princes and thus diluting the royal power. From everything I've heard about the god's wife of Amun, it sounds like a pretty sweet deal, especially with the perks of the job in this economy. Though it did have the unfortunate downside that you could only qualify for the position by already being born into royalty and wealth. Some things never change. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my Patreon where you can take classes with me in person. It's even more fun than watching me on a video. Thanks for stopping by.
Test action.
Sorry. One of the coolest things about being God's wife of Amun is that you would go into a little room with a statue and nobody knows what you did in there. Whatever you say is what they have to go with. And its elimination has nothing to do with But then a cat walked by and... Oh no. Every time I stop petting her, she's like, hey.
Hey, come back.
Hello, sweet love.
Action.
So what did this job entail? I don't know. And remember that... What would be done in this sacred space? In every temple of Egypt, regardless of what god it was for, religion. After her short regency for Thutmose III. Holding for the avatar of Bast. Okay, I'm just...